Welcome to the Casey Stengel chapter book talk with Dan Taylor. He's going to talk to us about baseball at the Abyss, which will be coming out April 12th. Just going to pass the ball over to him. There'll be a Q&A at about the 50 minute mark. And take it away, Dan.
Well,
thank you for coming.
Well, nice to see everybody tonight, and thank you very much for this invitation. I'm going to hit share screen, and oh, it says it's disabled. I can't. You got to. It says I can't share my screen. Let's see. I think you got to make me a co-host again.
Okay, hold on. How's that?
Yep. Okay. All right, all set to go. Thanks. Well, again, thanks very much for this opportunity. It's great to be with you. Topic of my talk tonight is Babe's Greatest Impact. And this is from my book that's due out April 12th, called Baseball at the Abyss, The Scandals of 1926, Babe Ruth, and the Unlikely Savior Who Rescued a Tarnished Game. And one of the things that really amazed me as I was doing research into this topic was what many people really felt was Ruth's greatest impact on the game. Strength training, or it's commonly known as strength and conditioning, has really over the last 15, 20 years become a major part of big league baseball, and not just big leagues, but the minor leagues. Every team is now mandated, has to have a weight room in their stadium. And in recent years, they've been mandated to add a second weight room for the visiting team so players can get in a workout prior or even after games. Every spring training complex has a large weight room. Academies down in the Dominican Republic now have very large weight rooms as well. And in the last few years, baseball has mandated that every minor league ballpark have a weight room as well. So the question is, where did all this come from? And what amazed me was to find out that it actually came from a hot dog gulping, whiskey and beer chugging guy by the name of George Herman Ruth, which I was really surprised to learn. So the roots of this go back to 1927. And in the early days of 1927, baseball was really tattered. It was in a bad place. The week before Christmas, 1926, a major scandal had erupted in baseball, and it generated huge headlines in papers all across the country. And some sports writers went so far as to say that this scandal was actually worse than the 1919 Black Sox scandal involving the 8 Chicago White Sox players who were accused of taking bribes from gamblers and throwing the 1919 World Series. And one of the biggest reasons that many sports writers felt this was as bad, if not worse, than the Black Sox scandal was that it involved two of the biggest players, two of the most popular players in the game, Ty Cobb, who at that time was the player manager of the Detroit Tigers, and Tris Speaker, the center fielder and manager of the Cleveland Indians. And the genesis of all this was a retired left-handed pitcher by the name of Dutch Leonard. Leonard had played for Cobb with the Tigers, been a very good player in the teens with the Boston Red Sox, still has records in the game to this day. But Dutch Leonard had stuffed in a drawer in his home letters from Cobb and also from Smokey Joe Wood that really implicated Cobb and Speaker in the fixing of a game, if not more games, in the 1919 season. Now, Leonard had never had any plan to make this public. He had kept these letters in a drawer, and he was in a conversation with a former teammate, Harry Heilman, when he let slip that he had these letters. And Heilman became very upset and said that he had to turn these letters immediately over to the owner of the Tigers, Frank Navin. Well, Heilman told Leonard that he had an appointment with Navin the next morning at 10:30, and that if when he spoke to Navin, the Tigers owner did not know about these letters, then Heilman would tell him himself. So Dutch Leonard went ahead, made contact with Navin, told him about the letters, and then turned the letters over to Ban Johnson, the president of the American League. Now, Johnson had a huge investigative force at his disposal. So he immediately launched an investigation, a very discreet investigation into the accusations. And it reached a point where he summoned Speaker and Cobb from an off-season hunting trip in Wyoming to come immediately to his office in Chicago. And while there, he told the men that they had no recourse. They had no ability to protest, no appeal. He was booting them out of the American League, and they could never be a coach, manager, or player in the American League ever again. But Ban Johnson made a promise to Speaker and Cobb that this would all remain confidential. He said he didn't want to hurt their families. He didn't want to damage their reputation. And he would leave it up to them to explain as they wanted their reason for leaving baseball. And that's exactly the way it played out. I mean, Cobb turned around a couple of days later and said that he was resigning as the manager of the Tigers because he couldn't win. He just felt that it was a bad situation, he said. As for Speaker, that was a little more difficult for fans to swallow because they'd had a second place finish in 1926 and really excited the fans there. And he was kind of vague in his reason for getting out. He just said he didn't feel like doing it anymore. And the fans in Cleveland really didn't buy it. And so they were a little more suspicious of that. But Ban Johnson kept it under wraps, and it stayed under wraps for all of about a month to 6 weeks. A reporter for the Chicago Tribune got wind of it, started pressing people in baseball for confirmation, and felt that he had enough to go with the story. And so that week before Christmas in 1926, the headlines came out that of this scandal and the involvement of Cobb and Tris Speaker. Cobb in particular was incensed when the word became public. And he really went on the rampage vilifying Dutch Leonard. And it was really interesting to read because he accused Leonard of all kinds of things, from being vindictive to doing it for money. And John McGraw, the New York Giants manager, actually told some of the New York writers that there was no vindictiveness to it, that he was very much aware that Leonard never wanted these letters to be made public. And as for money, most sports writers agreed, those that knew Dutch Leonard, that next to Cobb, Leonard was probably the second wealthiest player in the game. He had a huge farming operation in California and was extremely wealthy. So money wasn't a motivator for him to go public. But what was interesting is that while insisting he was innocent and attempting to vilify Dutch Leonard, Cobb sent Leonard a letter and pleaded with him not to pursue this matter. He said, "You have my future in your hands. Please, Dutch, go easy on me." And when this came out, December 21st, 22nd of 26, more followed. But what was really interesting is when it did come out and the news came out that Cobb and Speaker had accepted the banishment and didn't protest it, Damon Runyon, the legendary sports writer, to the question of whether they were guilty or innocent, wrote, "A man with a clear conscience does not commonly accept charges reflecting on his honor." But Swede Risberg quickly came public. Swede Risberg was the shortstop on the 1919 White Sox, one of the 8 Black Sox who were permanently banned from baseball. And he happened to bump into a sports writer in a pool hall in Minnesota where he lived. And when he was asked about it, Risberg, the former White Sox star, said, "Hey, that's nothing. I know far worse that has gone on in terms of fixed games." And he mentioned some that he insisted Ty Cobb was involved with. Well, this ultimately launched an even bigger scandal and even more headlines and a bigger black eye for the game. And it brought Kennesaw Mountain Landis into the picture. Landis at this point realized that Ban Johnson, when Ban Johnson said he was giving him all the information about what he had on Cobb and Speaker, he probably didn't. And Landis realized there was probably more involved. And he also wanted to silence Swede Risberg once and for all. So he had his own team of private detectives, and he launched them into action as they looked into all of these matters. And then in January 11th and 12th of 1927, Landis held hearings in his office in Chicago. They were extremely contentious. Players were shouting profanity and insults at one another. It was a very, very contentious 2 full days of hearings. And the difficulty that Landis had in both matters was looking at the accusations that Swede Risberg made and that Chick Gandil, White Sox first baseman tried to confirm, it was just one person's word against another. And Eddie Collins, the White Sox second baseman, was the only player who was able to provide any concrete evidence that really disputed the charges by Risberg and Chick Gandil. And the players that were named by those two all said that they weren't being bribed or paying bribes, that they were gifts, which was really common back then, that you were fighting for a position in the standings and a player had a big game that helped you jump up in the standings. It was not uncommon for teams to buy a gift or send money to the player who had a big game that helped them out. And in this case, Gandil and Risberg claimed that they were bribes, and the date of a check that Eddie Collins wrote proved that it was more likely a gift. So Landis really dismissed all the accusations that Risberg came up with. But as for Cobb and Speaker, their attorneys demanded the ability for their clients to face their accuser. And Landis continually tried to persuade Dutch Leonard to travel to Chicago for the hearings and to sit down face to face and take questions from the attorneys for Cobb and Tris Speaker. Dutch Leonard refused, flat out refused. And Landis persisted in trying to persuade him to come, demanded him to come. And Dutch Leonard had been threatened by people. His wife wanted him to not go forward with this, to stop it. And ultimately he told Landis, when Landis asked why he would not come to Chicago, Dutch Leonard said they knock people off there. And so because they were not able to face their accuser, Landis was left with no choice but to reinstate both Cobb and Speaker. And the owner of the Tigers said he did not want Cobb back. Connie Mack did. The Phillies and the A's and the St. Louis Browns both bid for Cobb, and Cobb chose to go with Connie Mack and the Philadelphia A's and played his last 2 seasons of his career with the A's. Speaker, similarly, the owner of the Cleveland Ball Club, said he did not want him back, and he quickly signed up and joined the Washington Senators and played his last couple of seasons with the Washington Senators. As this was going on, there was yet another scandal, and this one was in the National League, and it involved the best player in the National League, Rogers Hornsby. And news came to light in late December, early January of 27, that a bookmaker in Kentucky was alleging that Hornsby owed him over $92,000 in gambling debts. Hornsby disputed it. The bookmaker went public and it became another black eye. Hornsby was in contract negotiations at that time, and those negotiations over money kind of took a back seat to Hornsby's relationship with this Kentucky bookmaker. He had, as a player manager for the Cardinals, he had given this guy really unfettered access to his ball club. He was Hornsby's guest at spring training in Texas, socialized with a lot of the Cardinal players, and also on weekends when the Cardinals were at home, this bookmaker would travel from Kentucky to St. Louis, and Hornsby would allow him to be in the dugout prior to games. And so in Hornsby's contract negotiations, the owner of the Cardinals insisted that he disassociate with this bookie, and Hornsby refused. And as a result, that, as well as, I mean, they said it was his contract negotiations, that it was a money issue, but in reality, it was really the failure to disassociate with the bookmaker that caused the trade, and Hornsby was then sent to the New York Giants. That created another scandal, because Hornsby he was a 10% stakeholder in the Cardinals. He owned 10% of the ball club. And the owner of one club could not play for another club. So he was ordered to sell his shares because the Cardinals were coming off of a World Series championship. He placed a much higher value on his shares in the Cardinals than anybody else did, the owner of the Cardinals, or for that matter, brokerage houses. And this dragged out all the way to the night before opening day, when the commissioner and the president of the National League both told the Giants that if Hornsby didn't sell those shares, the Giants could not put him on the field on opening day. And Hornsby finally reached an agreement with the owner of the Cardinals to buy his shares and resolve the matter. So how does Babe Ruth tie into all this? Well, in one hand, a lot of sports writers were looking to Ruth to really clean the game up, to remove the tarnish from the image. But in reality, this was taken in early January of 1927 when Ruth arrived in Los Angeles. And these are actresses, they were called the Wampus Babies. They were PR representatives for the motion picture industry. And I think the fact that Ruth is photographed with a group of women and in front of a train is very fitting, because really at that point, Babe Ruth's life was a train wreck. He was in serious financial trouble. All intents and purposes, he was broke. Ruth spent lavishly. He didn't just own 9 cars, he owned 9 of the most expensive luxury cars, spent big on clothing, and it was not uncommon when when the Yankees were on the road for Ruth to leave suits and expensive shirts behind in his hotel room when the Yankees left for the next town on their road trip. He also was a heavy loser at the track. There's stories that are legendary of losses in Cuba, losses in Florida, and he was in serious financial trouble at this point in his life. He had his problems in his marriage, separation, and he gave very generous concessions to his wife in their separation agreement. And Christy Walsh, who many of you may have heard of and know about, he had become by this point Ruth's completely trusted business manager. He began as a guy with an idea to do ghost-written feature articles for Babe, made some pretty healthy extra money on the side for Ruth that way. But when he saw what was happening in Babe's the business side of his affairs, ultimately he became his manager and in effect was really the first agent in professional sports. He arranged all kinds of endorsement deals for Ruth, took control of his barnstorming scheduling. And at this point, he was very, very fearful of Ruth's future for a couple of reasons. One, Ruth's finances, and that was a major objective of his to sort out in this offseason between the 26 and 27 seasons. And then the other was Ruth's future earning power. And one of the things he did was quickly after the 26th season, he arranged an exclusive deal with the Pantages Theaters chain, and they created a vaudeville show where Ruth would sing, sign some autographs, tell some stories. They would show a little film clip, and this would be booked exclusively into Pantages Theaters around the Western United States. And Ruth was paid $50,000 for this. The other deal that he worked out was a movie deal. And Ruth was signed to star opposite one of the biggest stars of the day, Anna Q. Nielsen, in a fun silent film that was called Babe Comes Home. And Ruth, if it met box office expectations, stood to make $100,000 off this. Now, one of the things that Christy Walsh had been working to do was to convince Ruth to invest his money. He really was fearful of Ruth's future and his family's future. And Ruth really wouldn't hear of it. Ruth spent his money as fast as he made it. But Christy Walsh recruited Harry Heilman, the Tigers outfielder. There he is in the picture again. But Harry Heilman in the offseason was an insurance salesman. And he got Ruth and Heilman together. Ruth liked and trusted Heilman. And Heilman laid out annuities and what they could do for Ruth. And ultimately, I go into a lot more detail about it in the book, but ultimately Ruth agreed to test the waters, and he put a little bit of money into an annuity. I believe it was $30,000. And then ultimately, Christy Walsh got Ruth to commit to taking all of the money he made outside of baseball and investing it. And once Ruth started to see the dividends and what it could do for him down the road, he became very enthusiastic about investing. And so that was a huge accomplishment of Christy Walsh's that particular off season. But the other was dealing with Ruth's health. And we've all heard about the bellyache heard around the world. 1925, Ruth had major stomach surgery when the Yankees were heading into Asheville, North Carolina for an exhibition game for the end of spring training. Ruth collapsed while getting off the train. A local doctor who came and checked on him at the team's hotel chalked it up to overeating. And that's where the media had a field day. But then the Yankees ordered him to go back to New York. And as the train was coming into Grand Central, Ruth was in a bathroom to comb his hair and freshen up when he collapsed again. And in this instance, he hit his head on a metal pipe and was knocked unconscious, taken to the hospital when he arrived in New York. And the doctors initially had the same prognosis or the same diagnosis that the doctor in Asheville, North Carolina had, that really this was just an upset stomach from Ruth's overeating. And he admitted that on breaks on the train, he liked to down a half a dozen hot dogs or more. But when his temperature didn't go down after a couple of days, they realized there was something worse, and it ended up necessitating major stomach surgery. And Ruth missed the first 2 months of the season, probably had his worst year in the big leagues that year. And the press just teed off on him. I mean, they were all over him throughout the season. Amazing stories of his eating habits and gluttonous behavior in restaurants. And there were a lot of projections that he was done, that he was really on the downside. And because he wasn't taking care of himself, he probably wasn't going to have many more seasons in the big leagues. And that concerned Christy Walsh. So what he did was he ordered Ruth to dig into his pocket and to hire a man by the name of Artie McGovern. Artie McGovern was a trainer. He was an old boxer, and he'd suffered so many injuries in the ring and had to have so many surgeries and treatments for broken facial and hand bones that he really got to know medicine and the body and rehabilitation very, very well. And he created his own business as a physical trainer. And Jack Dempsey, the fighter, relied upon him, as did many Wall Street executives. And so Christy Walsh ordered Ruth to hire him and bring him to Hollywood, where he wanted him to follow what Artie McGovern ordered during the time that he was in Los Angeles making his movie. And Ruth agreed to do it. And so throughout that time that Ruth was in LA, about 6 weeks, he followed Artie McGovern's instructions and trained very, very aggressively. I mean, he would begin his mornings with a 5-mile run. McGovern implemented a whole eating program for Ruth, no red meat, no sweets, couldn't eat his donuts and waffles in the morning for breakfast, couldn't have his planked steak smothered in pork chops that he liked for dinner, really changed his eating habits, made him stop drinking coffee, made him drink hot water instead. And Ruth followed it. He grumbled a lot at first, but he followed it. And McGovern set up a gym on the roof of the hotel. When they did the baseball scenes at Old Wrigley Field in Los Angeles, McGovern had equipment there where Ruth could train on the field after takes. And then he set up a gym at the studio as well. So on days when they were filming at the studio, Ruth could get workouts in between film sessions there. So when Ruth finished the 1926 season, he weighed in at 254 pounds. When he arrived in St. Petersburg for spring training in 1927, he weighed 218. And when he arrived in St. Petersburg, he went almost directly to a golf course to play a round before checking into camp. And a couple of sports writers who played the round with him, they marveled at how much longer he was off the tee. And when Ruth took his first batting practice with the Yankees the next day, his teammates marveled at the added power that he had and how much farther he was hitting the ball in batting practice. Of course, an interesting clip, if you're so inclined to check it out, Ruth has a cameo in a 1928 film, Harold Lloyd film called Speedy. They shot that film in July, August of 1927. So it was during the 27 season, and it's on YouTube. You can pull it up on YouTube. And the shots of Ruth are really striking, particularly the scene of him on a sidewalk waiting for Harold Lloyd to pull up in a taxi. I mean, he is so trim. I mean, you've not seen him like that since his early days with the Red Sox. So, of course, Ruth that year had his greatest season. And it really was huge. It was followed all across the country. It was just next to Charles Lindbergh's flight, one of the most riveting stories that year, that summer, throughout America. And Ruth had his biggest season, eclipsed his old record, hit 60 home runs. And of course, they went and the Yankees swept the Pirates and won the World Series. And the sports editor of the Pittsburgh Press, W.O. McGeehan, wrote, the interest returned to the national pastime. Instead of losing customers, it gained customers and new ones. They were coming to see Babe Ruth. So he had effectively wiped away the tarnish of the offseason scandals. But what's really fascinating is the tangible evidence of Ruth's impact on the game that year, because the American League attendance across most of the American League dropped. Now, the Yankees did well, of course. The A's finished in second, and they had Cobb and Eddie Collins, Zach Wheat, that generated a lot of interest, and their attendance went up. But everybody else, for the most part, their attendance dropped. The Senators, their attendance dropped 7%. The St. Louis Browns attendance dropped 14%, as did the White Sox. And in Cleveland, their attendance dropped 43%. They'd been a second place club in 26. Their 27 club was awful, and fans stayed away from the ballpark. How important was Ruth against all of this? Well, what's amazing is how much worse it could have been for some of those clubs. Because for Cleveland, 27% of their home attendance came from their games against Ruth and the Yankees. Philadelphia, which early appeared like they were going to contend and did not, 32% of their home attendance came from their games with Ruth and the Yankees. The Browns, 40% of their home attendance came from their games with Ruth and the Yankees. And in Boston, 47%, almost half of their home attendance came from their dozen games against Ruth and the Yankees. That's the impact of Ruth's home run chase that it had on the revenues of these ball clubs. What I found amazing is in 26, Ruth admitted, and it's startling given the fact that, you know, he killed the Yankees there with 2 outs in the 9th inning of the final game of the World Series, trying to steal second base and being thrown out. But he admitted that in the latter stages of the 26 season, his legs were gone. He didn't have his legs. But the way he worked out in preparation for the 27 season, 17 of his home runs came in a span of 26 games over the Yankees' final 27 games. He flied out to the wall 3 times in their final game, but in 26 of their last 27 games, Ruth hit 17 of his home runs. And that's staggering that he had that kind of strength at the conclusion of the season. And that's a testament to his training and his preparation for the season. The Sporting News jumped on that. The Sporting News, of course, the publication of the day for baseball fans, it jumped on that. And after the World Series, they had a huge spread all about Ruth and training and their opinion about the importance of training and what teams and players should do. And in their article, they wrote, Ruth became the first baseball player in history to employ a personal physical trainer. Babe Ruth should go down in history as having provided the most constructive contribution to baseball that the game has known. And who would have thought? I mean, I have friends that are strength coaches for Major League Baseball teams, and when I share with them that Ruth was the first guy to embrace strength and conditioning, they're shocked. They have no idea that their careers and the training that goes on in baseball really derives from Ruth. I mean, it took the game over 50 years to finally embrace it, but that it goes to Ruth. And what was an immediate effect after that 27 season? You probably have seen pictures on the internet of the physique of Lou Gehrig. Well, you know, he was in a big home run hitting chase with Ruth through much of the 27 season. He tapered off late, and he agreed late in that 27 season that as soon as the season was done and they finished their barnstorming, he was going to hire Artie McGovern and train with him, which he did and did for a few more years after doing so in 27, 28. Thanks. That's the crux of it. And I appreciate the opportunity to share that with you, and look forward to any conversation, questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you, Dan. I hope everyone can hear me. I have a chat thing open. If anyone wants to type something or if anyone wants to ask a question, please do.
Gosh, I hope I didn't put them all to sleep.
Can you see the
I
chat?
can't see that. Thanks, Les. No, they really, the only issue that there ever was with the New York Giants, believe it or not. They were really looking for a box office player who could counter Ruth and really help them. And they also needed additional help to try to become a contender again. So shortly after the word got around the game that the Tigers had dropped Cobb, John McGraw made an attempt to reach out and try to sign Cobb to join the New York Giants. And Commissioner Landis stepped in and said that, we need to look at this a little more closely. And he denied the Giants the ability to try and negotiate with Cobb. So that was really the only controversy. I mean, as soon as they were Cobb was reinstated, both the Dan Housley, the manager of the Browns, and Connie Mack were on a train to Augusta, Georgia. Housley was a real close friend of Cobb's, and it was his hope that friendship, even though the Browns really didn't have the money to make a big offer, that the friendship could persuade Cobb to join the Browns. And Mack came in and made I believe, $60,000 a year offer, which was second to what Ruth was making. And so he agreed to go to Philadelphia, but there really didn't seem to be any controversy throughout the season. Really, the only controversy was that some of the big name guys, in particular Zach Wheat, was really past his prime and didn't perform well, and there was a lot of criticism for them having signed him.
Dan, I've got a question. I wonder if you're going back to the Buck Leonard scandal, if you could speak to the conflict between Van Johnson and Commissioner Landis and how that played out. Sort of
conflict is putting it pretty mildly. They hated each other.
Well, they hated each other, and Van Johnson was near the end of his life, as I yes. recall. I think he died just a year or so later. But how much of that was a factor in terms of how Landis actually wound up dealing with the situation?
I think it was a big factor, to be honest, Thomas. I think that, I think Johnson resented Landis. He'd been such a huge autocrat and been able to control the American League. And now with the commissioner, he didn't have that ability anymore. And he really resented Landis. So, he thought he was simply taking care of the Cobb speaker situation. And Landis realized that he had kept stuff from him, and Landis was pretty upset. And Landis felt that some of the leaks there were a lot of stories that were getting into the paper critical of Landis and how he was handling things. And Landis was convinced they were coming from Van Johnson. And so when he finally resolved the investigations and the whole Cobb speaker matter as well, he called a meeting of the American League team owners. He ordered them to come into Chicago because he wanted Van Johnson dealt with once and for all. And I think some of what Johnson did through it, he was upset with Landis for, that it got out in the public. And I think from the publications that carried it, it was clear those were publications. From all the stuff I read, they really struck me as having a connection to Van Johnson. And that led me to believe that there was one in particular, a particular magazine that seemed to leak a lot of stuff and also was very critical of Landis. And it really gave me the impression that Johnson was the leak. And I think that Landis believed that as well and wanted something done about Van Johnson once and for all. And so the American League owners got together and they were going to deal with it when they got word that Johnson wanted to meet with them the next morning. And when he showed up, it was very clear that he was not a well man. And his attorney told him that he was going to take time away from the game and ultimately would leave the game for health reasons.
Yeah.
I hope I answered that okay.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think you mentioned Johnson's attorney, whose name was Killian, I think.
Yes.
Who played a role in the negotiations early on in that whole scandal.
Yes.
Yeah.
There was
Okay,
a comment you mentioned
Susan,
about Gehrig, and that you'd seen pictures of his physique earlier in his career. Yes, he was a football player as well, very good football player. So yeah, he certainly did some type of training, but nothing of the degree that Artie McGovern had him do.
I have a question. Floyd Lapp, great presentation.
Thank you.
And I had heard another potential scandal, and you may be able to unearth it, or maybe you'll say, I've never heard about this before. As we all know, the Yankees lost the 1926 World Series to the St. Louis Cardinals. And the story that I heard in the final game, Ruth was on first, and I think there were 2 out. It was a close game, maybe a 1-run difference. I'm not sure of that. Maybe you could correct me. And for whatever reason, Ruth decided to steal second, was out, the game was over. And there was some question marks about why that play, and was there some type of, to use the word again, scandal involved with that? Have you heard about this? What's your take on this?
No, I never saw scandal attached to that. I think in most things that I read, it was what a bonehead play, and why was Ruth going? Now, Huggins said, Ruth was trying to help the club. He was trying to take a chance.
Right.
He didn't knock Ruth publicly over that, but no, I never saw anything scandalous. The one thing that did break, when some of the talk of these various other allegedly fixed games came out, it was Ban Johnson was screaming that the New York Giants threw the 1917 World Series, and he put that out there repeatedly, and he was very upset because it was his league that was constantly being accused of fixed games. And so Ban Johnson got upset about that and said, why doesn't anybody look at the New York Giants in 1917? And ultimately Landis, when all this smoke cleared on all of this, ultimately Landis said, I did thoroughly investigate it and there was nothing to it.
Thank you.
I think somebody popped up a question about the specifics to the Cobb speaker thing. And I can address that if you'd like. What happened was the Tigers were fighting, I think it was for second place at that time. It was very late in the 1919 season. And they had a game with Cleveland. Cleveland already had their position established, or maybe they were fighting for third. Off the top of my head, I can't recall the specifics. But the Tigers were fighting for position. Cleveland already had position. At the end of a game, of a particular game, I think it was the first game in the series, Cobb and Dutch Leonard bumped into Speaker and Smokey Joe Wood under the stands in Cleveland. And Cobb made mention, boy, we really would like to get past these other guys if you could help us. And Speaker said, I'll see to it tomorrow that you guys will win if I have to pitch myself. And he ended up throwing a young pitcher, and the Tigers won big. I mean, the articles all talked about how they couldn't believe that Speaker. They said that Cleveland played like they didn't care, and one wrote that Cleveland played like they wanted to get out of there and get home quickly. And there was a little bit of truth to that, because they were booked to take a boat from Detroit back to Cleveland, and the players didn't want to do it. They wanted to go back on a train. And so that's why Speaker said they wanted to get the game done quickly so they could be sure and catch the last train back to Cleveland. But the letters, what further exacerbated this problem was that Cobb and Speaker went out and put money on the game. After Speaker said he would see to it that the Tigers would win the next day, Cobb got some players together, got with a guy who worked at the ballpark to be the guy who went and placed the bets, and they put a fair amount of money on the game, and that's what really upset Ban Johnson, and then the guy who placed the bet came in and showed he showed Landis a betting slip that he said it was for a horse race, not for the ball game. And Landis's detectives were able to prove that the betting slip was forged. So that was the particular game and the issue involved. And the letters were explaining to Dutch Leonard about what happened with the wagers. I think Smokey Joe Wood said his guy didn't get to the bookie in time to place the bet. Cobb was thanking him and laying out how much he had made with his bet on the particular game. And that was kind of the major sticking points of one of the letters that Dutch Leonard had.
Dan, very fascinating stories that you've been telling us. I have a question. If Landis was so high and mighty after the scandal of 1919, and all of this is coming out in 1926, 1927 about Hornsby and Speaker and Cobb, why didn't he ban them as well? After saying that no one who was in any form involved in fixing games or even knowing about it is going to be banned for life. And now why did he just let this slip by? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first, thanks for the kind words, Mark. And to your question, he was never able to prove. What the players claimed was that the money was going as a gift and not as a bribe. And he could never prove it. He was such a stickler for following the rule of law. The judge in him, the way I read this, it really struck me that here was a guy who was following what he would have done had he still been on the bench. And, he was looking for tangible evidence to prove that it was a bribe and not a gift. And the only tangible evidence that was ever brought forward regarding the Swede Reisberg claim of the particular game he was claiming was fixed, it was a check that Eddie Collins had, the White Sox second baseman. And they were able to, Gandil and Reisberg were able to lay out the date that they left the ball club to go to Philadelphia to pay this other ball club what they said was the bribe money. And they said they had collected the money from all of their teammates. They said that Buck Weaver held out, but they pointed out that Buck Weaver later felt guilty that he held out, and he bought a gift that he gave to the opposing manager. So the only piece of tangible evidence was this canceled check that Eddie Collins brought to the hearing and showed Landis while he was on the stand. And the check was written well after the season. And so in Landis's eyes, that's a gift because he wrote it out and the payment was made well after the season. And it wasn't a bribe that was written out prior to this particular series. And that was the only tangible evidence he really had to go on. And as for Cobb and Speaker, he read the letters, and there was a lot that came out in the hearing and in the Cobb Speaker Leonard matter that as soon as it was done, he implemented all kinds of new policies and rules. Gifts were banned. That whole practice that had been done forever was outlawed, as were a number of other things. He simply couldn't prove it. And I think it was a huge frustration for him. And the whole Cobb Speaker matter, again, it was a legal technicality, if you will, that the attorneys were demanding the ability to face Leonard, for Cobb and Speaker to be able to face Leonard. And they were both very vocal to the press, and it was written up a lot in the press that, they demanded to face Leonard, and Leonard just wouldn't come. And so it really left Landis, the way Landis explained it, his hands were tied, that, he couldn't punish them because he had no evidence to prove that they had thrown this particular game. Now, if you're going to follow that up, Mark, and ask me, what do I think? Yeah, I think they did.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dan.
I hope there weren't a few typed questions that I might have missed.
No, I was following the chat pretty good. I think you got everything. Does anybody else have anything else to add?
Well, I think it's such fascinating stuff that you're revealing. It's probably going to be a fascinating book to read.
Thank you.
And just with what's going on with now gambling being legal, etc. And
scary. It's scary. It really is.
It's scary stuff. And who should have been banned and who should not have been banned, and why is Pete Rose the one person that's suffering right now from all of this? It's just
and there's SABR, and members of SABR have done a marvelous job of researching the 1919 White Sox and that entire scandal. And so it was really fascinating to go back and reread it and look at those things and see what went on, and then to read about this and a few other things in the game. It was really striking, but then to see what Ruth did as far as his training, and I was just completely amazed. So it was a fun project to research and a fun project to write.
Okay, so if we're done, I'd like to thank Dan. It was an excellent presentation. Again, it's Baseball at the Abyss, April 12th. It's available on Amazon, every place else you could possibly imagine. And good luck with it, Dan. And
thank you very much. I've enjoyed being with you and hope to be with you again in the future. It's great.
everyone have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.